Okay. So, welcome, and it's lovely to see many of you to this Oxford Future Professionals Oxford Seminar Series. The last presenter for this season is Professor Fabian Stephany. I'm going to introduce him briefly. And just to also say that this seminar will be recorded up to the point when we actually break into Q&A. Fabian Stephany is here at Oxford Internet Institute as an assistant professor in AI and work. So that's kind of central topic to the seminar series. He has been serving in various institutions also, notably at the World Economic Forum, Global Future Council on Human Capital, but he's going to be talking about his findings and his work on this SkillScale project, on which I guess you've been working quite a few years now. So I really look forward to hearing the updates around it. And he's titled the seminar, AI's ripple effect on skills and labor markets, something that we're all concerned about. As before, I think that Fabian's going to talk for a good 45 minutes or so uninterrupted. So if you have questions, clarifying or otherwise, I encourage all of you to put your comments and questions in the chat function. And of course, we can start with those once Fabian finishes talking. So over to you. Welcome, and thank you for agreeing to give a seminar.
Thanks so much, Mari and Julian for organizing this and for your invitation. I've been enjoying greatly from the other side and watching people in this seminar last term and this term as well. And I've heard quite some inspiring talks already on various aspects of artificial intelligence, how technology and artificial intelligence is changing our world of work, to be more precise. And to dive deeper into this topic, I'd like to have a closer look at the aspect of skills, AI and skills, which has been the focus of the research project that I had the privilege to run now in the third year. So we've completed more than 2 years at the Oxford Internet Institute. Just to give you a bit of an idea, my background is in economics. I've done a degree in sociology and in social science statistics as well, but this is preliminary looking at things developing on the labor market from an economist, a labor economist's point of view. And of course, there are other aspects that could be highlighted in this research, and I'm probably sure that people find these aspects and I hope they come up with them in the Q&A session later on if they have any questions on this. But before I might be triggering questions here, I'd like to have a first initial question to you. I already share my slides, but just to put this in perspective, we've been hearing a lot of changes are supposed to happen and are evidently happening in our work lives and private lives because of technology like artificial intelligence. But one of the biggest changes that's been announced, well, not recently, but over the years already, is that, of course, artificial intelligence or adjacent technologies like machine learning and robotics are supposed to take over work. So supposedly making us unemployed or redundant on the labor market on a large scale. And I've been wondering, or that's the starting point for our project, whether this is actually taking place. So I'd like to take you on a very tiny time travel right now to the time before the probably biggest labor market crisis that had happened over the last 25 years. I mean, I hope that current financial politics in the United States are not going to escalate further and make this sound like a joke just in a few weeks. But probably the biggest crisis we've seen was the one of the financial crisis in 2008, and which had tremendous repercussions, as we probably all remember, on the labor market. And looking at the vital signs of the labor market and taking this more broader historical stance, what do you think? Do you think that compared to the level before the financial crisis in Europe, let's say, do we have now more unemployment than before the financial crisis, or less unemployment? Who's for more unemployment? Give me a thumbs up. Like before the financial crisis of 2008, obviously unemployment went up, and then but is it now lower than before or higher? Is it higher? So who's for higher? Give me a thumbs up on that. There's a thumbs up there, Julian, and feel free to use the emojis. But so far I haven't seen many thumbs up. And then thinking about the other most vital sign of the labor market, that's vacancy rates. So firms looking for work, for workers. What do you say compared to the pre-crisis levels of 2008? Do you think we have higher vacancy rates right now than back then? Who says higher? Yeah, hands up for higher. Yeah, I see two hands. And oh yeah, many thumbs up. Okay, so this is wonderful, because this means that you are a very, very informed audience, because you're right. If you look at the heartwarming commonplace for labor economists, which is called the Beveridge curve at the European Union, so this still includes, for statistical reasons, the UK throughout this entire time series. You do see that, of course, after 2008, it's a bit of a weird thing to read, I admit, for non-economists. So you can follow the line along the years, from 2008 and then up to 2013. There you see a spike on the right-hand side, and then you're going back on the chart to the top left. What you see essentially is that, obviously, unemployment spiked after the crisis. And then something interesting happened. It went down again, and now reaching kind of the lowest levels of unemployment that we've seen over more than 2 decades in the European Union. But at the same time, we have very high vacancy rates, actually, if you look at that. And interestingly, you could put on many of these dots, you could put some really milestone developments in terms of technology, right? So you have the development of DeepMind, a company in the UK that has been influential in the development of AI, the development of convolutional neural networks. You have in 2013, you have a paper by my colleagues Carl and Michael, Carl Benedict Frey and Michael Osborne. I believe Carl also spoke on this forum a few terms ago, where they said that in 20 years, half of the population might be unemployed because of AI. But interestingly, despite all of these tremendous changes, and in 2022 or 21, of course, you had the emergence of generative artificial intelligence, chatbots like ChatGPT, we do not see massive unemployment, right? We rather see, if we trust this chart, the contrary. We see a decreased unemployment rates and a significantly rising vacancy rate. So demand for work, at least in the European Union, but this looks very similar for many other regions of the world. And indeed, if we have a closer look at the numbers, last year, 60%, almost 60% of all small and medium-sized enterprises in the European Union reported that they had difficulties to recruit specific types of talent. And the type of talent is exactly the talent that is probably facilitating or supposed to facilitate this technological development around AI, and that is ICT talent. So people working for small and medium-sized enterprises in the field of information communication technologies. And this is really, really interesting, because it stands in such a strong contrast to the messages that we read in policy papers and research papers, but of course that we also over the last years have been accustomed to seeing on social media, because every day we're bombarded with messages that another round of AI development, another round of large language models, of generative AI, is supposed to make us unemployed, lose our work at a large scale. But this is, at least right now, not happening, and quite the contrary is happening. But what we see is a seemingly paradoxical situation. We see that people speak about unemployment a lot, but at the same time, we have many firms that are actually starving for talent. They're looking for talent, desperately looking for talent, and for finding people with the right skills. And this has become known as a phenomenon as the so-called skill gap. So there are people on the labor market that kind of have this sentiment that their skills are becoming outdated, that AI or other digital technologies are becoming increasingly capable in performing these skills in the labor market. And at the same time, on the demand side, we have many firms that are desperately looking for people with the right skills, particularly with the skills related to technology, as we see in this number, in this 58%. So often people who are supposed to have the skills centered around digital technologies like working with artificial intelligence. And this skill gap, which has become a relatively commonly studied phenomenon in labor economics and digital economics these days, is not only disrupting the workforce, but also the economy and the society as a whole. Just to give you a few numbers, so 13 million people in the UK recently reported that they lack essential digital skills. So not only to master the workplace, but also master their private lives, administration and getting access to all sorts of private and public services. At the same time, the World Economic Forum has estimated that the GDP loss, the global loss in GDP until the end of this decade could surmount up to 1.5 trillion US dollars because of the skill gap, because of this mismatch on the labor market. And then lastly, in terms of societal developments, in terms of political action, 70%, for example, of the people who voted for Donald Trump in the last election are people who, according to a recent Pew survey in the United States, reported that they feel that their skills are running out of date, that their skills are no longer as valued as they were on the labor market. And this skill gap is precisely the starting point for our research group, where we wanted to investigate a little bit more and see, like, okay, how does this skill gap unfold? Is it really true that certain skills have become outdated? And what happens to the other side of the market? What happens to the skills that are seemingly, apparently, very much in demand? And I'd like to walk you through just a brief selection of 3 papers that we have developed over the last years. They are in different stages. Some of the research is already published. Some of this work is currently in the last stages of a revision, and others is just at the beginning of the academic publishing cycle. I'd like to start with a paper that we have already published in technological forecasting and social change, and that looks at the skill gap in particular in 2 specific fields. We already spoke about the field of information and communication technologies, or more specifically about artificial intelligence, developing artificial intelligence and maintaining artificial intelligence. But also another segment of the labor market where this skill gap becomes very apparent is the one of green jobs, is the one of roles that are centered around sustainable technologies, centered around renovation, restoration, but also, of course, the development of technologies such as solar energy or wind energy or green energy, generally speaking, because this is another segment where the demand and the supply on the labor market don't match at all. Because we see in many countries like the UK, for example, but also other countries like Germany, a very strong growth, very strong movement towards sustainable practices and sustainable technologies. But apparently, the supply side is not ready to match these demands. Firms are desperately looking for people with the right skills in these domains. And here we went into investigation and looked at a practice that is called skill-based hiring in a paper which is called Skills or Degree, where we assumed that when certain skills are more and more in demand, firms are doing everything to get their hand on this type of talent. And what we've known from the past, from literature, is, and I'll spoil some of the findings already in this headline, what we know is that firms who are desperately looking for talent, they are often dropping formal degree requirements. So they're often much more focused on specific skills than formal degrees. And that was essentially the starting point for this investigation, where we wondered whether certain specific skills centered around AI and centered around green skills have become more relevant than formal degree requirements. And so the question is, are firms switching to skill-based hiring, to this new form of hiring, if this demand on the labor market is exceeding the supply side by far? And as for much of this research that we've been doing in our research group, we use data stemming from online job vacancies to investigate this question. So online job vacancies, for those of you who are not familiar with this type of data, is essentially the job advertisements that we encounter when we go online and search for look for a new position. So firms from all parts of the economy, all parts of the labor market, can advertise positions on job boards like Indeed, LinkedIn, or Glassdoor, for example, where they advertise positions. And these positions have all sorts of valuable information, pieces of information that we can investigate for studies of labor markets. So we know where this position is supposed to be located. We know which type of industry, which type of occupation this position is situated in. We also, interestingly, of course, know how much money has been offered for this position. And definitely a key piece here for us, which types of skills are being demanded for this type of position. And we've been looking, roughly speaking, over job market demand in the UK in this specific paper over the last over the last 6 years. And what we see, to jump straight into the findings, is that on the left-hand side, we see that the demand indeed for both green, that's the color also as well, and AI jobs, blue is the color for AI roles, has been increasing significantly. There's a bit of a dip for AI roles, which is due to some layoffs in the software development sector. But overall, if we compare this to the growth rate of other domains, other skill domains of the labor market, this is a tremendous growth that we're seeing on the left-hand side figure, more so for green jobs actually than for AI roles. And what we also see at the same time is that these roles seem to be very skill intensive. So the top right chart tells you that compared to any other job vacancy on the labor market, it is green roles and AI roles that demand on average many more skills, are much more focused on skills than the average job advertisement. And to give you the final piece starting on the descriptive end of this research, we also see that there seems to be quite a sizable wage differential, quite a sizable wage premium for certain types of roles, which we see in the bottom right chart. Here we are looking at the median annual salaries that are being offered over time for these positions. And here we see a tremendously higher pay for AI and AI roles. That might not come as a surprise to people who are familiar with AI jobs, but also for green roles, we see a widening gap compared to the average posting on the labor market. So the first part of this picture, where we wanted to look at whether these roles are focusing on skill-based hiring, the first part of this picture, the first hypothesis seems to be we seem to have indication that there's something going on, that these roles are more skill intensive, definitely, than other positions. But we also wanted to look at what's happening to formal degrees, to formal education, so the requirements for formal degrees in these positions. And here we see the change over time of the most commonly used brackets for formal education. So technical degrees like HNC or HND degrees, bachelor's degrees, or master's degrees, or PhD degrees being required in these positions. And again, we have the three buckets that we're looking at. We're looking at job advertisements that have been asking for certain AI skills on the very left-hand side, for green skills in the middle, and for the rest of the labor market on the right-hand side. And we see that, interestingly, on average, AI skills, and I'll try to focus a bit more on AI skills in the interest of this talk and interest of time. For AI skills, we see that, of course, on average, the requirements are higher. So the higher education, there are more postings requiring higher education degrees than for any other position in the labor market. But what we also observe on the left-hand side is that there seems to be a steady decline. It seems to be the case that fewer and fewer roles are requiring formal degrees in the field of artificial intelligence. And the prevalence, though, of higher education is only one aspect. We also had a look at the premium that these types of education actually has, because, as you remember, we also have wage information on these postings, and that's the other chart that we're looking at here. So usually, bear with me, I'll try to walk you through this chart. So usually, what we see on the labor market is that the higher the educational requirement for a position, the higher the wage, right? So you would expect that compared to a position with no higher education being required, you have higher wages being offered for bachelor's degree, even higher for master's, and the top level wages for PhD degree. And that is what we also see on the very right-hand side. We see this very smooth educational, or actually pretty neat educational premium, where you have higher wages being offered for a bachelor's, a master's degree, and even much higher for PhD degree. Though if we look, interestingly, on the left-hand side of this chart, we see that for AI roles, this premium has vanished entirely. There's no more statistically significant premium, at least in the online job vacancy data, when we look at the field of AI for a bachelor's, a master's, or a PhD degree. So in other words, while the wage levels are relatively high for these positions, there doesn't seem to be a top-up for asking for a bachelor's, a master's, or PhD degree when we look at the field of artificial intelligence. And we wanted to know, like, okay, but where does this phenomenon come from? So where we stand right now, we observe that skills have become more important for these positions, and actually degrees have become less relevant for these AI positions. And we were wondering, like, okay, but can we actually relate this to an increase in demand? Is it because that these positions are so sought after that skills have become more important than formal degrees? And that's what we looked at in our last part of the analysis. So we run the analysis that I showed you already across all years and across all occupations in our labor market. And we wanted to see whether higher demand for AI roles is also related to a higher premium for skills, which we see on the left-hand side is actually the case. And it is the higher the demand, the lower the premium is for conventional education, actually, for formal degree requirements. And what this chart is showing us quite neatly is that in occupation and times where the demand for certain skills has become very, very high, the premium for having these skills is relatively high as well, and the premium for a formal degree or for a bachelor's, master's, or PhD degree is relatively low. And we gathered this evidence together to conclude that actually there is a form of skill-based hiring happening in the UK, particularly for the field of for the field of artificial intelligence, because it's hard for the labor market supply side for workers to meet the growing needs of the demand side of firms in the field of artificial intelligence. Though when you take a closer look at the literature, money is only one thing that firms can actually offer to attract talent. So again, we're reminded that in this situation, we see that the labor market demand for AI talent is outpassing the supply side by far. So again, remember, many firms are struggling to get their hand on adequately skilled talent. What we know from previous situations or from past situations in the literature is that, of course, as we've seen in this previous paper, in the first work that I showed you, firms are offering more and more money for people with the right skills, for having AI skills. But what we also know is that there is kind of a tipping point, right? There's a saturation point where money can't buy more talent. There's a marginal return to offering higher salary, because of course also other things are relevant when you look for a job, and this is also a demographic aspect. We know that for the cohorts that had just recently entered the labor market or are about to enter the labor market, the Gen Z, for example, we know that salary, the trade-off between salary and other perks, such as leisure time, such as a nice working environment or parental leave arrangements, for example, that the trade-off has become more and more tipping towards these non-monetary rewards compared to previous generations. And hence, in this second work that I'd like to portray you, we wanted to investigate whether workers are in the field of AI, whether firms are actually trying to attract workers by offering more non-monetary rewards. So when I talk about non-monetary rewards, you could think of many things. I'll be outlining a few of the rewards that we looked at here in our analysis. Not all of them, but the most predominant one, or the most specific ones. And this is actually a relatively broad range. So just to mention a few of these rewards, it's often around paid leave. So this is data from the United States. In this context, paid leave, of course, has a different connotation than in European data, because the restrictions on holidays, on paid vacation, are stronger than in Europe. So paid leave would mean that people can take additional leave from their work and still being paid. It's about workplace culture, so it's whether people, for example, are offered facilities on site like gyms or like recreational spaces. But it's also about very things that have become very important over the last years, like remote work options. So whether your firm offers you the option to work from a different place than the factory or the firm's place, and it's also, of course, about parental leave, which is definitely something very relevant as a perk, as a non-monetary perk on the labor market, whether your company supports you in taking leave for taking care of a child. And what we see on the left-hand side is comparing the prevalence of these perks across AI roles and non-AI roles. We see kind of a mixed picture. So there are certain domains where we don't really see a big difference. So for health and well-being, for example, there isn't a really big difference between the prevalence of these non-monetary perks, comparing AI roles and non-AI roles, as we see here in the yellow chart. But for other domains, there is definitely. So when we look at parental leave or workplace culture or remote work, for example, we see, looking at the example of remote work, we see quite tremendous differences. So the probability of seeing these perks being offered for AI roles is twice as high for AI roles than for non-AI roles when it comes to remote work. And once we look at this we gain more insights when we look at this over a time series perspective, and that is that this gap has been widening over the last years, and not surprisingly, of course, in the aftermath of the pandemic. So we've seen, for example, that from 2020 onwards, we see a clear increase, sticking to this purple line, which is remote work, a clear increase in the odds of seeing these perks for AI roles compared to non-AI roles. So to read this chart, to better understand this chart, 0 means there's no difference essentially between an AI role and a non-AI role, and everything above the dotted line means that the chances of seeing such a perk in an AI role is higher than in a non-AI role. And we see actually quite a tremendous increase again for remote work, for workplace culture, and over the last years also a modest but significant increase, for example, when it comes to parental leave. So parental leave is being more likely to be offered for AI roles than for non-AI roles. We also, of course, wanted to move beyond the descriptive level and tested this in a model where we controlled for various other characteristics. So we put in individual controls, such as where these people are working at, whether this is a blue-collar job or white-collar job, what kind of education is being required for this type of position, which industry, which occupation this role is in. And what we still see is that for our 3 candidates, for parental leave, for workplace culture, and for remote work, the coefficients are still positive. So these coefficients essentially mean, like, does it make being an AI role, this role being an AI role, does this make the prevalence of these perks more likely for you to be seen in a job advertisement compared to non-AI roles? But what we also see is that, of course, the more we add controls in these regressions, individual controls such as the occupation, industry, or education, or once we're adding salary, we see that the coefficient decreases. And this is an interesting aspect because one of our hypotheses was, to what extent is salary being exchanged with these non-monetary perks? And this type of model indicates that there seems to be some kind of exchange between the non-monetary perks, such as remote work or workplace culture, with salary. But even in the full model, to remind you of this, even in the full model where we control for various characteristics, including salary, we still see that, statistically speaking, it's more likely to observe non-monetary perks such as parental leave, workplace culture, increased workplace culture, and remote work in AI roles compared to non-AI roles. Just to dig a little bit deeper, and this is the last part of this investigation, we wanted to know, but is it really true that there is an exchange with money happening for these roles, and how did this develop over time? So here we're focusing on the 3 aspects, on these 3 perks that I mentioned, and I'd like to particularly highlight parental leave in the major chart that we're seeing here. The first thing to bring home this finding again is that comparing non-AI roles, which are the gray lines on the bottom, and the AI roles, we see that the salary, of course, on average, is much higher for AI roles than for non-AI roles. But interestingly, what we see when we compare the solid line and the dotted line, which is roles with a benefit, that is parental leave in this case, compared to the roles without benefit, which is the dotted line, we see that the gap over the last years has been widening. And this chart essentially tells us that it is in addition to higher salary that these benefits are being offered, which in our investigation was part of an indication that tells us that it is not a substitute, but it is rather a complement. So these roles, AI roles, already have some of the highest salaries on the labor market. But once we split the AI roles up again into those that have non-monetary benefits, we see that the salaries for the roles with the non-monetary benefits have even higher salaries. And this tells us probably that at this dot up here on the solid blue line, this is really the peak of firms looking for workers and trying to sift through a very thin talent pool by not only offering high, extremely high salary, but also offering benefits such as parental leave, for example. The charts look similar for well-being and for workplace culture. So offering this on top of relatively high salaries. And we've went through a couple of regression analysis to confirm this again, and I spare you the details on this. But the main message to take away here is that firms apparently are not offering only higher salary to get their hands on AI talent. They are also offering relevant non-monetary benefits, relevant non-monetary perks, such as remote work, parental leave, or health and well-being or workplace culture treats at their firms to get their hands on people skilled in artificial intelligence. Lastly, I'd like to divert a little bit away from these the value of AI skills and whether it's a monetary or a non-monetary value. And in the work that we're currently just popped out as a working paper, and we're currently reviewing this for a major journal, we wanted to come back to a very old question, and that is the question: to what extent, I mean, not that old in historical terms, but in terms of your current labor market discussions, of course, it's kind of a question that has been coming up over the last decades. To what extent is technology, is AI specifically, complementing or substituting our work? And to give you an example, we probably all had these aha moments when we looked at models like ChatGPT or Claude, and you name it, generative artificial intelligence or large language models. For me, one of the aha moments where I was really surprised or stunned by the capabilities of these models when I was preparing my scripts for my students. So some of my lectures, one of my lectures is around teaching people how to use computational methods, how to web scrape, how to extract data from the web. And I essentially told one of these models to write a script to do that, to extract information from, let's say, the sports page of the BBC. And I was really stunned by how within seconds this model was able to write a script that I myself, an autodidact in web scraping, would have needed at least a day probably to write a scraper that functions properly, and like, or maybe half a day. It should be maybe a bit more generous with myself, but much longer than the model actually did. And of course, you might have had similar situations in your workplace trying to work with those models, and that might be at first sight bad news for people, because they think like, okay, now these models have become extremely capable in what I used to shine in before. But at the same time, you could also think of, being relieved from a certain duty that might have been also part of a repetitive work routine, right? Because writing scrapers, once you've passed the point of the first thrill that you're capable of doing that, preparing this for your lecture, in my case, in my example, was a really repetitive part of my work. And I perceived it, after a bit of contemplation, as being freed up of this repetitive task and having more time to actually focus on the things that current technologies are not so good at. And that is, for example, negotiating with my students, right? My students are really bright people, smart people who ask a lot of difficult questions, like resilience and teamwork are things that have become, that are also very important in this type of skill bundle of job. And so now that the technology is taking care of these more repetitive technical tasks, I might have more time to focus on the so-called human skills, so if you want to call it like that. And this is the central question, or the central assertion in this last paper, and that is AI is increasing the demand for human skills. And we went back to the literature where people had come up with similar hypotheses in policy reports and in research papers over the last 10 years, and where they proposed that actually, now that AI is able to do much of the technical work, like summarizing papers, like writing emails or writing code for you, you might have more time to focus on aspects like resilience and agility, like self-efficiency, like critical thinking or teamwork or ethics skills, for example. And here again, we were wondering to what extent we can find evidence for these developments in online job vacancy data from the United States over the last six years, broadly speaking. And what we imagined are two types of effects that we imagined to find on the labor market, and that is a so-called internal and an external complementarity. So just to give you an example, what we think is that a data-savvy job or an AI-savvy job, like the data scientist, for example, so people who made it their work to crunch numbers, to distill information and knowledge from data points, that much of their work or certain parts of their work can now be done very efficiently by artificial intelligence. Much of the data crunching is now, and the clustering and machine learning can now be done by AI. But this might increase actually the implication, or the implication might be that this might increase the demand for ethical skills. So for data scientists to understand how these black box algorithms, how these convolutional neural networks, these deep learning algorithms actually work. And so the demand for ethical skills might have increased for people who are directly working with AI technologies. That's the internal complementary. That's the internal effect that AI might have on human skills, such as ethics. Then the other part is the external complementarity. And here, just to make this clear, I will try to make this clear again throughout the remainder of this talk. We're looking at people who are not working with artificial intelligence. So contrary to the data scientists, we're looking at people like HR managers who are not directly working with the technology, but at the same time, they are still confronted by certain spillover effects. To give you an example, the data scientist here on the left-hand side might come up with a data-driven recommendation of certain candidates to invite to an interview. But now the HR managers also need to have an understanding, have to be able to critically question this outcome, right? How does the machine, how does the AI come to this conclusion of recommending this candidate? Or to give you another example, on a higher level, so not so much on a firm level, but maybe on a regional level, once certain AI technologies like self-driving cars, for example, become more and more prevalent, such as they are already in the Bay Area and in California and around San Francisco, the authorities on the ground, the regulating the traffic, of course, also need to have an understanding on how this technology really works. Like, why do self-driving cars make certain decisions when it comes to everyday traffic, or designing everyday traffic? So in a nutshell, these are people who are not working with AI, who are not designing or maintaining AI, but still we hypothesize that the demand for human skills, for skills that are complementary to AI, might also increase for these people. And so to have a look at the data on a descriptive level again, we looked at the internal part first. So we looked at AI roles first. What we did is essentially, we wanted to know whether certain human-centered skills, such as ethics skills or working with others, digital literacy, are more prevalent among AI roles than among non-AI roles. And this is what you see in this chart. Again, the line at 1 tells you the odds are the same. So it's the likelihood of observing these human skills are the same for AI roles as they are for non-AI roles. And we do see quite some stark level differences, right? We see some skills that are well above this line, like analytical thinking, resilience and agility, and technical proficiency. And we see other skills that are mingling around this line. But there's also a lot happening over time. So for some of these skills, like for technical proficiency, we see a pretty strong increase over the last years. So how to read these numbers? For technical proficiency, at the end of our time series, at the end of 2023, we see that 16% of all AI roles had required this skill, but only 6% of the non-AI roles had required this skill. So this is more than twice as likely to observe this skill for AI roles compared to non-AI roles. And interestingly, we see similar pictures for resilience and agility, or critical analytical thinking, for example, with 35 to 19 or 11 versus 6%. Interestingly though, we also see, we also see for ethics skills, while initially ethics had hovered well below the line, so it was much less likely for AI roles to require these skills, we now see that it has been increasing over the last year. So we see an increase where we now reached a point where it's become almost, the chances almost 50-50. It's 31% versus 35%, and where we think that this is clearly also probably also a policy-driven development, because in more and more AI roles now, policy demands people to have certain AI skills, to be knowledgeable in ethics skills, to be knowledgeable in ethics when they're working with AI. We also had a closer look in regression models where we controlled for various characteristics such as seniority or the educational level or the type of industry that we're looking at, where we see that actually almost all human-centered skills are more likely to be observed in a role like the data scientist. So we had a closer look at the role of the data scientist in this specific example. And some of these skills, like analytical thinking and resilience and agility, are significantly more likely. So how to read this chart? A value of 1 would mean it's twice as likely to observe these skills controlling for many, many other characteristics of the posting in a data science role compared to non-data science roles. Interesting though, the information contained in these postings, in these job postings, also allow us to say something about the value of these skills. And here we ran a different model where we looked at the economic value, the added value of having these skills. And here we see that for some of these skills, particularly ethics skills sticks out, we see that there is also a significantly higher wage being offered. So data scientists with ethics skills are offered salaries that are up to 10% higher than without these ethics skills. And you might wonder, like, okay, why is it that the prevalence is so low and the salary is so high? This seems to be contradictory at first, but actually I think this is probably two sides of the same coin. It is still not that prevalent to observe ethics skills among data science roles, but once they are demanded, it's really, really important for the firms to have these skills, and hence a significant wage premium is being offered for data scientists with certain ethics skills. Then to conclude this, we also wanted to have a look at the external complementarity. So again, be reminded, we're talking about people who are not required to work with AI and who are just affected by the spillover effects of this. And what we did is we looked at again the United States, and we looked at various years and occupations, and we looked at the AI penetration in these occupation years. So we looked at how much artificial intelligence is being demanded, is being penetrating these occupational types, occupations and industries, actually occupations, industries and regions to be more precisely, and how much does the demand for these types of skills change? And here on the left-hand side, we see that there is a significant positive correlation between the AI penetration in certain types of occupations. So every dot here is an occupation year in the United States, and the demand for certain complementary skills. We also looked at substitutable skills, by the way, which I'm showing you here for completeness sake. You find more information on this in our paper. I don't want to stretch it too far here. But what we see is that the decline in substitutable skills, such as basic writing and basic reading skills, is only very, very moderate. So it's not the case, compared to the complementary skills, that with more AI penetration, we see a strong decrease. We see a slight decrease in substitutable skills, but once you contrast these two effects, we see that the complementary effect is much larger than the substitution effect. So in a nutshell, the more AI is penetrating certain occupations in certain years, the increase in demand for complementary skills is much higher than the decrease in demand for certain substitutable skills. And we ran this again, not only for occupations, but also for industries and regions, and not only for the United States, but also for the UK and for Australia. And our findings are on average, but for a few changes if on the regional level, where data quality is probably not as good as we hoped. But for occupations and industries, we see a pretty clear picture that we see a strong increase in complementary skills once we have more and more AI penetration, and only a mild decrease in substitutable skills with more AI entering these occupations, across industries, and across all the three countries that we examined in this investigation. My question is a slight look towards Mari. I think I still have 15 minutes, right, on the clock. Is that correct?
Well, if you could, wrap up in the next, sort of 5 minutes or so. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
Perfect. I'll be making it quick then. So just a few policy recommendations that we have gathered throughout the research that we conducted here in the SkillScale group. We have, of course, many. We've partnered with many institutions, with unions, with education providers, with tech firms, but also with small and medium-sized enterprises. I'd like to bring up two of them, and just, of course, in the interest of time, very, very briefly, though in our work, and feel free, of course, always to reach out. We have many other recommendations that we try to bring up. The two that I'd like to point out here is that there is obviously this gap. There's this skill gap of what the market is demanding and what people have. And some and firms and workers alike are struggling with this, though some firms are not struggling with this. So some firms, like big tech firms such as Google, have made learning part of working already. What this means is that they acknowledge that there's this constant need for reskilling, for learning how to work with new technologies, and they've institutionalized this by giving their people paid time in their workspace, in their work time, to develop these types of skills, and also guidance on which types of skills are being necessary. Of course, smaller companies with less oversight and less financial resources do not have these resources, but it's definitely worth acknowledging that the working place is a good learning place, that the place where your work is happening has a lot of information on which skills you might want to learn to excel and to improve the quality and the efficiency of your job. And smaller firms could be subsidized and could be supported in doing this to catch up with big industry giants. The other part is that many employers, particularly from small and medium-sized enterprises, they lack the oversight, as I said. They don't really know if the skills that are people advertising on their CVs are the skills that they're really knowledgeable in, whether a certain person really knows how to program in Python, really knows how to develop machine learning algorithm. And here, it might be interesting to think about closing this gap, this information gap, in the same way as we do it, not with programming languages, but with actual human languages. So people who want to apply for working at or studying at the University of Oxford, for example, they have to take an English test if their mother language is not English and they haven't completed a degree in English before. And we could think about establishing test centers like this for coding skills, of course, as well, allowing people to, regardless of where they learned their skills, increasingly they do this autodidactically, to show how proficient they are in these skills, get credits on these skills, get a certificate on these skills, and move to the labor market with these specific certificates, so that it's not that difficult anymore for firms to actually assess the quality and the proficiency of these skills. And with this, I'd like to conclude and of course warmly recommend you to visit our project page, which is skillscale.org. And I'm happy to see that I still got at least 10 more minutes for some question and answers. Thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you, Fabian. That's really great.